the next presentation by Emilie. So Emilie is currently a PhD candidate in sociology and economy. Emilie have worked for at least for the last 10 years on technologies to alleviate poverty, with a particular interest on the sustainability of infrastructures. Her PhD focuses on social, economic, and technical longevity of solar mini-grids in off-grids village in Africa and Peru. Emilie is from University of Grenoble, and now I'll give you, I'll let you share your screen and to present your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be back, even though it's virtually to Sorbonne University, because it's also where I studied my master degree 10 years ago. So it's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to talk about my research on the future of solar projects, which is a PhD I just started in Grenoble. So with two research labs. One is a social lab called PACT, and the other is an economic lab called GAEL. And my research is funded by the French state and also by the company Schneider Electric. And I have just started back in December, even though this PhD topic actually builds on my professional experience in NGOs in South America and in France and in the UK. So before talking about mini grids and Sustainable Development Goals number 7, which is the one about energy, I want to go back to the word sustainable. The word sustainable and sustainability have become very popular approximately 30 years ago with the concept of sustainable development, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which focuses on the kind of impact we want to have or the kind of impact we want to avoid for future generation, with 3 dimensions: environment, society, and economics. And more recently, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are goals around different sectors that also we want to achieve. So we have goals on energy, hunger, etc. So again, we talk about the kind of impact we want to have and the kind of impact we do not want to have. But if we go back to the first definition of sustainability, actually what we mean by sustainability is quite different. We actually, and here I took a definition from an online dictionary, but you can find similar definitions in other areas. Here, sustainability is more related to the time aspect. Here, it's the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level. So we really have a time component that is much more important than in sustainable development and sustainable development goals. If we look at the last definition from the OECD, and this is the body part of the OECD that frame evaluation, here again we find this time component and defining sustainability as the continuation of benefits. So what we see here is we have a little bit 2 different kind of definitions. On one hand, sustainable development and sustainable development goals, talking about the kind of impact we want to have or the kind of impact we do not want to have. And on the other hand, we have the time component. And looking at most of the current literature, or even how sustainability is used in newspaper, in reports, I am wondering, where has the time component gone? Because every time I look for sustainability paper on Scopus, on Google Scholar, I got a lot of things about impact, but not so much about the time component. And that is not a trivial question. And now I'm going to go back to my SDG, which is SDG 7 about energy. I want to focus on the time component because it is important, because longevity of energy access cannot be taken for granted. SDG 7 promises to increase energy access, clean, affordable, sustainable energy access. One of the ways that energy access is promoted is through solar products. And now I'm going to focus only on solar products and not on other ways to electrify or provide energy to who don't have, well, not energy, but electricity. So I will focus on solar energy because it's one of the most promising technology with also nice environmental impact. So what I'm going to say is not a criticism of solar energy. It's just about the fact that we just cannot assume that just because we have installed something, just because we have given electricity access, this access will last forever. So here are a few figures, which I personally find very depressing, but that also led me to start this PhD. So here you can see a problem with infrastructure in Kenya or in Bolivia. So here is not specifically about mini grids, but it's about solar products. You can see that after a few years, things stop working. And it's not only a problem about the technology itself. In Madagascar, another study found that in some villages electrified through mini grids, about half of the people have disconnected from the mini grids because it didn't suit their needs. And a last study, which is more recently and using other kind of methodology, which is using nighttime light, have found that approximately half of mini grids seems to have failed. So really, what is happening? What is electricity access not being sustained in time? And that is my research question. I am wondering how solar energy solutions, which are usually considered as autonomous in the sense that they are off-grid, so that means that they have a specific ecosystem, how they are actually maintaining relationship with the environment through complex and evolving socio-technical and economic networks. So I have four research areas. The first one is about governance, because I am assuming that governance is important if we want to understand how mini grids perform in the medium and long term. So here I am looking at who are the stakeholders, what are the regulatory aspects, so what are the laws that can hinder or foster mini grid sustainability, what are management models. And the kind of approaches I'm taking, it's based on development anthropology and also management of the commons that was mentioned during the first conference that we had today. My second hypothesis is that payment and economic autonomy also matters. So here I am looking at the business model, but also the technologies that people use to pay, technology and also the way they get the money to pay for the electricity service, such as microcredit, mobile money, remittances, and I am also looking at rural economics characteristic. So let me just go back to this last point. Here, this is important because when we talk about energy access through mini grids, usually we talk about kind of remote villages which cannot benefit from the grid extension. And those villages often rely on agriculture as their main source of income. But what we know about agriculture is that revenue is not stable along the year. It varies. When you do your harvest, you have more revenue because you can sell your crops. On the contrary, when you are planting, you don't have a lot of revenue. Nevertheless, you need electricity probably all year long for illumination, for your fridge, to store vaccines, etc. So how the instability of rural economics articulate with the sustainability of electricity needs. That is one of the aspects that I'm looking at. My first research area is about maintenance and technological aspects. So going back to the technology itself, to understand how it is operated, maintained, and how end of life and afterlife are implemented. But the current that I'm using are not only looking at technology. They are looking at the interaction between technology and also humans. So here I will use an approach called actor network theory, and also maintenance and repair studies that recognize that infrastructure are fragile and vulnerable, and that as human beings, they also need care all along their lives. And my last research area is about uses and users, because we actually cannot tackle the other research streams without thinking about who is using the electricity and for what, and is this use in adequacy between what has been thought of, like the script usage, and the script in practice. So here, one of the theory that I will use is the practice theory from Elizabeth Shaw. About my methodology, I am using a qualitative, multiscalar, and longitudinal approach because and this also echoed a lot the first presentation that we got. We are tackling a quite complex problem. And so I need to look at different kind of scale. And I also need to look at evolution on time. So I'm looking at the global panorama and how it can influence sustainability in practice. And I'm also looking at specific countries. So I will be focusing my research on Peru, Senegal, Nigeria, and Kenya. And my first circle of analysis, so that is where I am now after 4 months of PhD, is to look at funders, funding agency, how they can influence sustainability by the kind of fund they give. And I'm also interviewing researchers and consultants to see how they are shaping the whole thinking about sustainability. In that broader circle, I will also interview national authorities. At the vicinity of the village and the mini-grid, I will also look at operators, people in charge of maintenance and operation, and also internal migrants who go, for example, to the nearest city to have a better job, and who are then able to send money back to the village to pay for electricity. And my little circle is then the village and the users, looking here at equipment and the use of electricity. And now I'd like to present you some preliminary findings. As I said, I am at the first stage. So what I've done until now is interviews with global players who are funding, who are influencing the way countries are being electrified through mini grids. So what I have found in these first interviews about my first research stream about governance is that one of the problems is about transparency and accountability. Funding agencies are not always very transparent on the way they allocate money and how they are using the resources. And this is also matching another mirror problems, which is that national authorities who are in charge of electrification supervision often lack resources to monitor and follow up what happens with mini grids. They often lack human staff, but also money, and they also lack information, which goes back to my last problem, talking about the principal agent problem, which means that there is no transparent information that would allow national authorities to monitor exactly what is happening through the mini grids. On my second research area, which is about payment and economic autonomy, until now I have interviewed mainly global players. So that means that I have mainly point of view from the mini grids operators and funding agencies. And here, unsurprisingly, what we have as the perception of sustainability is mainly financial viability. So that means that from those actors, having a sustainable mini grid is basically having a mini grid that can cover its costs. So the implication that we have here is that these kind of actors tend to focus more on the risk that can threaten financial viability, such as demand risk, such as that means that, for example, people are not using as much electricity as it was planned, so they're not paying as much as the operator was expecting. There is also the risk of competitors, like the arrival of the national grid, which will threaten the mini grids. And there is also a risk of policy changes, especially when operators are relying on recurrent subsidies. For example, they receive subsidies every month, depending on the demand. And if there is policy change, these subsidies might be withdrawn. And against that, new schemes are being tested, for example, with demand guaranteed concessions, which is something happening in other sectors, which means that companies, operators, mini grid operators sign an agreement with the state and say, I am planning to have a demand for electricity of 100. If I have less, the state will pay me the difference. I also got some first finding from the point of view of users' ability to pay. And here it depends how you see it. You want to see a half empty cup or half full cup. So it depends on the actors you talk with. Some actors will say that the price that people pay for electricity for mini grids is not expensive because it is cheaper than alternatives such as diesel generators. But other actors will say that still tariffs often remain too high for the poorest. So that means that some people cannot access electricity. And here are some solutions that we have been discussed during these first interviews was about cross subsidies. So that means that consumers who are richer can pay a higher price for electricity, and that higher price can subsidize the poorest. Or another promise is using productive use of energy to increase income of the poorest and thus their ability to pay. And on my third research area, because on the fourth one, I don't have results yet, that will happen after I talk directly with users. So about maintenance and technological aspects, I was very surprised to discover that the way that mini-grids are funding is not neutral. Some kind of funding can actually hinder mini-grid sustainability. And one example was given about results-based financing. So this is a kind of financing when a company gets money according to the number of households they connect to a mini-grid. The problem with that is that the funding is triggered only through the connection of the household, but not on the continuity, not on the sustainability of electricity access. So that means that some operators, to lower their cost, they invest in low quality infrastructure which do not last. Another aspect that was mentioned during these interviews was the difference between continuous and alternative current, but I won't dive into this because I do not have enough information. And the last aspect was about waste management. So waste management for solar equipment remains absolutely incipient. There are few recycling and treatment facilities, which is not surprising because even in Europe, we do not have so much treatment facilities, and there is also no clarity of who should be responsible for recycling. Should it be the mini-grid operator? Should it be the company who produced the solar panels or the batteries? Should it be the state? It's not clear. So some concluding words about that first stage of my studies. And here again, it's very nice because it echoes a lot the first presentation we get. And what we get was thinking about sustainability is complex. We don't have one problem, one solution. We have to think about multiple scales. We have to think about multiple times. We also have to think about multiple systems. We cannot look only at technology. We cannot look only at society. We need to see how both interact. But I am very passionate about this subject because there is so much at stake. How can we use more efficiently the resources we have to make impacts last longer instead of every time building new infrastructure to replace the previous one who has lasted very little time. That is to say, how can we achieve twice sustainability, positive impact, and making them last? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emilie, for your presentation. That was very, very interesting. Do we have questions? And everybody can ask questions. All the participants in the Zoom can ask questions, not only the speakers. So, any question for Emilie? Charlotte, we have a question. Charlotte has a question. Is how did you choose your case study?
Yes, that's a very good question. And actually that took me 2 months. So I first look at feasibility. So in the sense that I wanted to have countries with a lot of mini grids to be able to compare different mini grids within one country. So I selected a first row of countries which have a diversity of mini grids, for example, with public management models, private management models, community or NGO-based management models. Then, unfortunately, I had to withdraw some countries from my initial list because of safety issues, because as this will require field studies, I needed to have countries when I can travel safely. So I have to remove that. And that led me with around 10 countries. And these 10 countries, I analyzed them with different variables. So I'd look at how mature is their regulation systems in terms of mini-grid sustainability. So for example, do they have a rural electrification agency? Do they have mechanisms for the arrival of the grid? I also look at criteria for the sustainability from the point of view of the operators. So can operator access grants? Is there a mechanism to compensate operators in case of the arrival of the mini-grids? And I also look at criteria through the consumer point of view. So can they benefit from cross subsidies? Can they also benefit from innovation such as mobile money? And I also look at the alternatives that they have. So for example, I chose the case of Nigeria because in Nigeria, mini-grids is a very interesting solution because the national grid is very unreliable. So that means for consumers, there is a positive incentive to use mini-grid electricity instead of the national grids. But at the same time, it's a sole country where there are a lot of diesel generators. So that means people, well, it's double edge. On one edge, that means that people already have an experience with electricity. They have already probably equipment to use with electricity. So they might be less reluctant to use mini-grid energy, but on the same time, they are already paying a lot for electricity. So they might be more in favor of adopting a lower cost technology. So basically, I cross all these variables to select studies that have different profiles and that still allow me to have a diversity of mini-grids in one country so that I can compare different management models.
Thank you very much, Emilie, for this detailed answer. Do we have other questions in Zoom or in Slack? Well, if we don't have other questions, we can move on to the last speaker for this theme.